Today is our Science Policy Day, and we are doing another dual panel today. So we have Ben Schmitt and Yi Pei visiting us. Thank you so much for coming. It's great to have you both. And how this will function is I will introduce both of them briefly, and then each of you will give about roughly a 10-minute introduction. You can talk about your career path, your life journey to get where you are. You can focus on different aspects of that you are more open to getting questions on. And once we've done that, then we'll open the floor to discussion. And Jasmine, Gail, and I will be reading questions. Hi. Yeah, either over the Zoom box, or you can raise your hand in the participant panel and ask a question yourself. That all being said, if you would like to turn on your video, that would be great, so our speakers can see who their audience is and see your reactions to what they're saying. If not, that's also fine. Okay, so Ben Schmitt is actually at the CFA, well, not currently, but works at the CFA, and has worked at the US Department of State as the European Energy Security Advisor from 2015 to 2019, among other things. I'll let you tell them more about everything else. And then Yi Pei used to be a postdoc at the University of Illinois and is now a budget and policy analyst. So I'm excited to also hear about your journey. So let's have Ben go first. I can time you for roughly 10 minutes and I'll let you know if you're going like drastically over time.
Sounds good. Thanks, Rebecca. Hello, friends. Great to be here. And I just think it's so important that we're talking as a science community about the important role that scientists and technologists as practitioners have to play in the U.S. Policy process in general. What I'll talk about more is the foreign policy and national security process in particular. I think it's incredibly important as we work on addressing some of the most pressing challenges, in my view, of the 21st century, to have scientists, as I say, in the room to help address these challenges. As we can see, as I'll talk about as we can go through into questions and answers, a lot of the multinational, transnational issues that we are facing as a country are increasingly multidisciplinary. And you really need to have the ability of a science or technology viewpoint at the table, along with people that have expertise in law, in international relations, in domestic policy, in budgetary policy and economics. All sorts of things need to come together to have the best policy response. Because if we focus on your standard practitioners all getting together and thinking the same thoughts on addressing some of these pressing issues, you may not get there, and we may not be as successful in addressing some of these challenges. And of course, that goes for both issues that are specifically, or you could think of as a science issue. Think of why we're all on Zoom right now and not together. COVID-19 and pandemic response, but of course also climate change and energy and things like that. But at the same time, also having these practitioners of science and technology looking at how they can benefit maybe more traditional areas of foreign policy, national security policy. The ability at the bottom line to, address international supply chains and technology development paths. As I've said when I was in government, building a large-scale telescope, as a lot of us do here at CFA, a lot of times, although it's maybe smaller scale in terms of funding, a lot of the same engineering principles and ability to interface with industry, they all kind of match and they all rhyme. So bringing that sort of expertise to the table is incredibly important when you're looking at things that you wouldn't think science and technology would have a part in, but they do. Things like sanctions policy, sanctions compliance, looking at energy supply chains, looking at critical infrastructure, dependencies and influence. and looking at the sort of issues that are really coming to the fore today, being technology reliance um, and critical supply chains, both for this country and among our partners and allies. Okay, so that's the broad brush approach. Where do I come in? I don't know. That's a great question. It really was not a plan of mine to go into the State Department. Certainly, I've long been interested since, I don't know, a kid, like probably a lot of us on this call, in science and technology, and in particular in astronomy. So it was always my dream and my goal to work in astronomy, work in astrophysics, and that's what I did. I went and did a uh, a Fulbright, U.S. Department of State Fulbright research fellowship after I did my undergraduate work in Heidelberg, Germany, where we worked on plasma diagnostics research. So it's similar to using an electron beam ion trap. I know that folks here have worked on similar um, uh, atomic physics and plasma diagnostics work for stellar atmospheres and interiors, for example, photoionization, looking at these sort of phenomena and having a better idea of how they work, both for understanding astrophysical processes and high energy density processes in stars and in astronomy settings, but also for example, domestic terrestrial thermonuclear fusion facilities. How do we get to a horizontal energy technology in order to get us to a post-carbon, post oil and gas hydrocarbon world? So, okay, so with all that in mind, I really wanted to get directly into astronomy, and I ended up going back to the University of Pennsylvania in the United States, and worked on developing, along with a team, ACT-POL, which is a new receiver, millimeter wavelength receiver, polarization sensitive receiver for the Atacama Cosmology Telescope in northern Chile. And this is really where the idea to come into the State Department by a circuitous route came into play. The long story short is that we put this receiver up on the telescope, and as we were doing the development process of this $15 million device, we decided that we wanted to paint this in some sort of design to be cool. My thesis advisor said, let's put racing stripes on it. Let's do something cool with it. But in the end, what we decided to do is put out a call to folks in the art department, in the visual arts department at the University of Pennsylvania. We ultimately got a professor to paint a large-scale mixed media mural that we then photographed and had an auto body wrap company actually wrap onto the telescope, and we put it up at the site, and supposedly became one of the highest altitude contemporary art installations in the world. I understand there's some more ancient art installations in the Himalayas and places like that. Anyways, so because of that, there was some interest in this, in trying to both do some critical outreach, as we do in science a lot on this front. And what we ended up doing was we did an art opening with this original painting at a gallery. And it turns out that the owner of the gallery is the honorary consul of Switzerland in Philadelphia, who was friends with the honorary consul of Chile in Philadelphia. And one thing led to another, and we started doing kind of more diplomatic outreach and working with the Chilean diplomatic community on, how can we increase, logistics and supply chains to make better use of scientists' deployments down in Chile. And along the way there, along with my thesis advisor, trying to figure out how can we actually purchase the painting. So somehow I got thrown into high level art, negotiations. It's not something I ever planned on, but along the way, one of the diplomatic contacts in that outreach campaign said, you could actually go and work at the State Department and consider that for something to do in addition to or instead of doing a postdoc. So I threw in my name into a few science policy fellowships. I ended up getting not the AAAS, but the IEEE Department of State Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, which specifically sends an individual into the department And I got assigned to working on European energy security issues, which basically, the long story short is I worked on countering Russian malign influence in the European energy sector, in particular along NATO's eastern flank. Spent a lot of time working on countering the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. This is a proposed pipeline, natural gas pipeline that the Kremlin was trying to build to circumvent Ukraine by bringing gas directly from Russia to Germany and then onward to its European markets. By circumventing Ukraine, a country that it's currently at war at after having illegally annexed Crimea and engaged in aggressive behavior and attacking in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine in 2014, starting in 2014. So I did a lot of work on that front, spent a lot of time in the field, worked for a summer, most of a summer at U.S. Embassy Kyiv, where I worked with I worked for Ambassador Yovanovitch, who many of you may know from the impeachment hearings last fall, and a lot of that sort of group of foreign policy officials. And so we all were working on supporting Ukraine's territorial integrity and security, and in particular its energy security on my front. So working on that, still wanted to come back and keep working on my main passion in life, which is science. And so I decided to come back last winter. In January, started that process and got here April 2019, and have been here working on the bicep array experiment and the CMB stage 4 experiment, basically developing instrumentation and doing project development and management for looking at how we're going to be deploying, designing, and integrating and operating new CMB facilities at the South Pole, Amundsen-Scott South Pole Station. So I was actually down there for a brief visit at the start of this year. Some of us, James Cornelison was on the call. He was there with me. We were starting social distancing before it was cool. And we got back, in early February, and just a few weeks later, really got into social distancing again. So that's where things stand. I've been able to do in my free time on the weekends and evenings when the mood strikes me. I've written some national security policy publications for a number of think tanks in Washington, and just this week published an op-ed in The Hill magazine with a few science policy colleagues from that are currently at the Duke University Center for International Policy on the need to bring science and technology practitioners into the mid to senior level foreign policy and national security enterprise of the United States, and kind of addressing those issues that I started this intro with. So with that, I just kind of want to leave it there. There's a lot to unpack, and really look forward to the discussion. So thank you for your attention.
That's great. People should definitely start thinking about questions over a wide variety of topics. What a journey. Let's go to Yi next for another intro, and I will time you for approximately 10 minutes. But good job, Ben. That was just over 10 minutes.
So I gotta say, it's really fascinating hearing Ben's path to and through policy, because it's so incredibly different from mine. And what struck me about the difference was the visibility of his work. So, being in the State Department and doing a lot of foreign policy, writing op-eds, these are all very outward-facing things that people will get to see. And I would say that what I do right now is the polar opposite of that. So I work at the Office of Management and Budget. I'm what they call a program examiner. First of all, a lot of people probably haven't even heard of the Office of Management and Budget unless you're in government. So not a lot of people know what we do. But all of the agencies that you can think of, NSF, NASA, Health and Human Services, Department of Defense, none of them would have their budgets every year to operate without OMB. What we do is we are sort of, I don't want to say gatekeepers, but that's kind of a good way of describing it. But so Office of Management and Budget is part of the Executive Office of the President, which is sits at the very head of the executive branch. So every federal agency falls under the executive branch. And every year, the president writes, well, we do it on his behalf, but the president writes a budget to Congress that says, hey, Congress, you who holds the purse strings, this is how much my agencies need every year, or what is going to need this fiscal year in order to do all of the things that they have to do. And here are all the programs they're going to do. Here's all the things, all the changes. Here's all the prioritization they're doing. Here's all the things that we don't think is priority. It's a huge undertaking, and OMB is the office within the executive branch that leads this process. So to give you a sense of magnitude, every year the budget proposal is like around, I think, $4 trillion for the entire federal government to operate. Of course, includes a huge defense piece, a huge mandatory funding piece, so Medicare, Medicaid, and then within that, every agency is very different. My portfolio is the National Science Foundation, which is at about an $8 billion a year agency at the moment. So every year, basically, my role is to review the NSF's their plan for how they plan to spend X billions of dollars, and then there's a whole bunch of considerations that we have to take into, like what does the OSTP, what does the Office of Science and Technology Policy want? What does the astronomy decadal say? Is an astronomy a priority? That kinds of stuff. And of course, there's the big picture concerns like fiscal constraint for this administration, wasteful spending, gotta curb that. So my job, and we're in the thick of that right now. So my job is really to synthesize all of this information from the agency and take into consideration all of these priorities from the different policy councils, and then sort of sausage make them into a list of recommendations for our leadership to consider. So most of the people who are program examiners in the federal government don't have a PhD, let alone a PhD in science. However, the NSF program examiner has always had a PhD in science. And the reason for that is because NSF, that's NSF's bread and butter, grants to universities. So if you've never done research before, if you've never, interacted with how university grants work, you've never interacted with, professors on a research environment, understand the expenses of running a lab, then you don't really have the expertise needed to sort of explain to higher level policy officials who definitely don't understand how science works as much as we do, why, for example, grants cost this much, or why it costs this much to develop something. So that's a summary of what I do. How I got here, so I got my PhD in 2016, but by that time I already knew that I didn't want to do research. I'm not cut out for the working on the same problem for 5 years kind of work. I'm much more cut out for the, it's 3 p.m. I got 5 deadlines due at 5, and I've had 2 of them done kind of deal. Which is a lot of what some of my days look like at OMB. So I enjoy that aspect of it. I enjoy interacting with people, synthesizing issues and discussions. There's a lot of room for creative ideas of, if the administration wants to implement this policy, like let's say, the vice president wants to go to the moon by 2024. How do you pivot NASA's budget strategy to go from, Mars exploration to focus on moon exploration? I don't work on NASA, but the NASA examiners are some of my closest colleagues. So I sort of hear about those things. So it's a very open-ended sort of job. And so I enjoy that aspect a lot. And then the other part of it is the reason that I really wanted to do policy in particular was that I felt like a lot of scientists were staying willfully ignorant about politics and policy. And there's this, this attitude that, science is objective, and therefore we're not subjective to anything. Scientists are not subject to anything, to any constraints, to any, to all of the politics that's going on. But really, if you think about it, where does NSF funding come from? It comes from taxpayer dollars. So why should, we as scientists get money from taxpayers if we're not accountable to, first of all, deliver public benefit, and second of all, articulate public benefit, but also we're also part of the consideration of all of the priorities of all of that $4 trillion of federal government funding, which are all taxpayer dollars. So in some ways, the way that the money flows, scientists are not so much different from defense contractors, if you think about it that way. So, it's this, I always felt that there was kind of this gap in understanding of how this whole thing works. And it frustrated me because it seemed like it was just counterproductive, to sort of shut a blind eye to how things operate and how the fundings operate and not really understand how it works. So my pursuit of policy fellowships was kind of like, I just want to find out how things work. I want to know how decisions are made at the highest level. I want to know what factors are considered in these considerations. And so that's what led me to apply to the Presidential Management Fellowship. I was looking at a whole bunch of policy fellowships, the AAAS. I didn't know about the IEEE or like the AIP ones. But AAAS was definitely a big one. And then the Presidential Management Fellowship, it's a lesser known, but actually, I think more prestigious in government, because a lot of people end up staying in government rather than AAAS, where you sort of do a 2-year stint and then you go back to what you were doing. So I started that fellowship, like I got the fellowship 10 months into my first postdoc, which is why I, jumped ship promptly and came to DC. And I did a very short stint at the Department of Homeland Security doing budgeting, and that was completely irrelevant to anything that I ever did in my PhD or prior. Budget outlays, obligations, and commitments, all of these terms, none of it made any sense to me. So I was a lot of drinking from the fire hose and learning from scratch. And then but at the same time, I knew that I wanted to be closer into where the policies were being made. So I was looking around for other jobs, because like as a budget analyst, especially at Homeland Security, you're like kind of down in the weeds. You don't really, it's not at the decision making level, but you also don't really get a big picture of, just how the government works in general. So I wanted something better. So while I was at DHS learning all of these things, I was applying to other fellowship positions. And that's when, through networking with the AAS Society's public policy director, he hooked me up with an interview opportunity with my current boss. He used to have my current job 2 people ago. So DC is a small place, and especially if you're, a PhD in astronomy, the cohort's even smaller. The circles are smaller. Everyone knows each other. So, that definitely helped give me a leg up. And so I've been in my current position a little over 3 years now. I'm working on my 4th NSF budget. So things are getting a little bit easier compared to the first year or 2 when I was drinking out of the fire hose. And I'll also add that as part of the fellowship, we're required to do a 6 months short assignment to another agency, a rotation assignment. And I was able to do mine on the Hill. I worked for the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology under the Research and Technology Subcommittee, which happens to be the subcommittee that oversees NSF and NIST and I think a little bit of Department of Transportation research. And I was brought on specifically, so I worked for the Democratic side in the summer of last year. which was the first year that they had gone from minority to majority. And they were in the minority for 8 years. So they had a huge backlog of legislative priorities that they wanted to get through. But what was also becoming apparent was that artificial intelligence was this hot topic that everybody wanted to have a say in, but they just did not have the bandwidth to handle it. Because when you're in the minority as a committee, you have 2/3 of the staff compared to the majority. So they were short-staffed. They had a lot of backlog, and they just didn't have the bandwidth to look into this issue. So I was brought on specifically to work on artificial intelligence. It was a very broad scope, but it was, learn everything you can about artificial intelligence, be the committee's point person on everything AI, figure out what position the committee should take on any hot issues that are coming up, put together a hearing, scope TBD, and then possibly draft a bill, scope TBD. So it was like a really a very open-ended assignment, but that was actually really fantastic because I got to define that assignment for myself. So in the end, I ended up putting together a hearing on AI and ethics, especially how artificial intelligence, when used incorrectly or when not enough care gets put into it, can disadvantage groups of people, and how common that is. And then right before I left, I drafted an earlier version of the National AI R&D Initiative, which after I left, somebody took it up, made some edits to it, and then now I think it's wrapped up in the National Defense Authorization Bill, which probably means it's going to pass. So that's a bit of my whole experience. That was actually a lot of fun, so happy to talk about that too. And then I'll just leave it there.
Okay, awesome. Let's transition into our Q&A portion. And just to let everybody know, I'm going to try to end at 12:50 so that people have time to go to their next meeting or take a break between meetings. Thank you both. Those were excellent introductions. I think I really got a complimentary duo of speakers this week, so I don't totally know that going into it, so I'm glad that worked out quite well. Thank you for contrasting each other. So yes, you can raise your hand in the participants window if you'd like to ask a question, or you can type it in the Zoom chat and I will read it off. I will start off because I have a whole document of questions. I tend to have a lot of questions about this type of job. I would want to ask both of you if you would have any advice for either undergrad students or grad students about training they can get or things they can be doing while they're still students if they already know they're like particularly interested in maybe getting a policy position eventually.
I'll go first on that one. So I didn't do anything specifically aimed at getting a policy job, but when I was in grad school, I was really involved in student government. I got some experience, looking at some how some of the university programs use their fees, but more importantly, like I interface a lot with my department's professors. They were trying to set up this like graduate mentoring program, and I ended up, and my advisor was kind of like somewhat on the hook for setting up that program, and he ended up coming to me for advice on what I thought was important in mentoring, and how to set up an effective program, how to get engagement, and etc. So interfacing with department leadership, university leadership, and understanding that there are a lot of competing priorities, understanding how decisions are made at different levels. I think that on my resume showed, so I think that helped more in my job, but on my resume, I think what really stood out was that I didn't just do research. I did a bunch of other stuff that I had broad interest, and that I was able to juggle a lot of other different activities while still, getting my PhD within a reasonable amount of time. So I think demonstrating that, because I knew zero about budgeting when I came into this job, and a lot of the stuff, and I'm sure it's true for industry jobs as well, you really do like things that are very specific to the job itself, you learn on the spot. So it's not whether you have
Yee, did we lose her? I
Yeah, it seems so. I'm not hearing her either.
Maybe she muted herself somehow.
I didn't hear her.
Oh, now she's muted. Okay.
yeah, now maybe unmute it.
Were you unable to hear me?
Just for a little while. That was strange. It dropped
Oh.
off, but it didn't have the mute symbol on, so I thought I was losing my mind. But
Oh, it was, I think it's my unstable internet connection. My apologies.
I think maybe like a sentence or two back. We lost it.
Okay. Yeah, so I was just saying it's not about knowing the particulars. It's not about knowing, how Congress works, how the budget works. It's more about demonstrating that you have the capacity to learn those things on the job.
Yeah, and I'll jump in and say that I would not encourage people to take my path and assume that you need to know fine arts dealership and things like that. That is absolutely random. I took absolutely no preparatory steps to do this as a career choice. I was involved in a few of the congressional visit days of my various professional organizations. So I did one with AAS, American Astronomical Society, for example, and was also called on through a graduate fellowship that I had through NASA Space Technology Research Fellowship, to go to do a day on Capitol Hill and meet with congressional members and do things like that. So, but that was not really part of any sort of plan. What I would recommend highly for folks is that at most, if not all of the schools that you may be at, and certainly this is the case at Harvard, there is a rich tapestry of policy, both domestic and foreign policy, and other policy adjacent departments that run truly world-class lectures, panel discussions, seminars that are open to either the Harvard community or the university community, or open to the public. So please take advantage of that. That is not something that I did at Penn, and I've always regretted that, to be honest. I didn't think of it. I was in the lab building instrumentation and designing things in SolidWorks and doing data analysis, and I never thought of taking a break for an hour and walking across campus and hearing, a world leader, some world leader that came to campus to give a speech or something like that. I think it's completely helpful for getting a sense of what the pressing issues are, and you really have world-class researchers right on campus with you that you may not think of taking advantage of, but you can. You're there, and that's what I would recommend, maybe above anything else. The other thing is to, if you are interested in these sort of things and you want to go the fellowship route, both he and I obviously were in different programs. In fact, I actually, at the same time that I applied to the IEEE program, I did apply to what at that point was the first year of the PMF Presidential Management Fellowship STEM program. And that actually, I got a finalist position there, but then there were no positions because it was the first year and they actually didn't know, there was no jobs posted for it. So there was no opportunity. So I'd actually be interested in if you went through that, or just the quote standard PMF process, if that has gotten up and running, because I would definitely endorse PMF STEM if it's still running, is a good way to compete to get into the government as well, if you want to do that.
So actually, my year was the first year that they got rid of PMF STEM, because what ended up happening was the people who applied to PMF STEM did not have the flexibility to do a non-STEM job, and it was actually, it was very, very limiting, and it was I don't know why they designed it that way. It was terrible. So they just opened it up to everyone. I still think, I always think the government could use more STEM. I always think the government could use more BIPOC folks. So definitely the PMF is a great way to go, because it's fast. So a lot of people end up staying in government, and a lot of government leaders are former PMF. So there's a huge network, and getting through that PMF finalist application, it almost gives you like a stamp of approval that it's like, yes, you have all of these qualifications to be a good leader in government, and people recognize the name, and you can do some incredible things as a PMF.
Yeah, and I want to point out, even though I ended up not being one, given the program's now apparently defunct as well, so it didn't really go that well, I guess. That the difference, just for folks on the call, that the difference between that and the other fellowships is that has a path for permanent employment as a federal civil servant, whereas all of the other fellowships, for the most part, do not have that. Mine did not, for example, and it makes it very difficult to onboard if that was your, if you get in government, really love it and want to go on. It makes it very difficult to stay. So PMF is a great opportunity. Notwithstanding all of the great people and future leaders that are in it, but also just from a career standpoint, it gives you an onboarding opportunity that you wouldn't have otherwise.
Sorry, Jessica, I have a follow-up question, but then we'll go to you after this. So just to be clear, PMF STEM is no longer a thing, right? But PMF is a thing.
Yes, the PMF program itself is going strong.
Okay. And does AAS advertise this type of fellowship? Have you two seen this in the astronomical community?
So AAS has a fellow, they have one fellow. So, okay, so the PMF and AAAS are, I mean, they're not really the same, obviously, because one is science focused, but they both are set up in similar ways that you get into the finalists of those, and then there are ways to allocate a number of fellows across the government, it depends on the year, how much budget they have, depending on how many actually get taken and on board, but you can be spread out across the government, whether at is at OMB or NSF or DOE or State Department or Pentagon or anywhere. The difference with all of the other professional society fellowships like AAS, IEEE, which I was, and then AIP and others, is that for the most part, they usually have one or two fellows that they can onboard, mostly for budgetary reasons, that's the size of their program. And so they are usually allocated to a very specific, job set. So AAS, as I understand it, still runs or has run in the past a 2-year fellowship where you actually go and work at AAS headquarters, and your duties are writing policy briefs and doing engagement with the Hill, stakeholder engagement on the importance of STEM funding for supporting astronomy, for example, and things like that. Whereas IEEE, they have the State Department fellowship. I got it and then only could go to the State Department. There are other ones. AIP has something where you go to the Hill. You can only go to the Hill. So those are the kind of offshoots of the number of these programs.
Cool. Thank you. Let's go to Jessica.
Okay, I have one comment and one or two questions, depending. But the first comment is COVID is a really great time to use Harvard's resources because everything's on Zoom. So the Kennedy School has a bunch of good things. I'm on the Shorenstein Center list for policy and technology, and it's been really interesting. And Harvard attracts really interesting speakers. And then the law school has the Klein-Berkman Center on Internet and Tech and Society, which has some really, really great talks. And a lot of the people there are involved in policy decisions, but they bring in policymakers too. So both of them are very accessible. Once you get on the list, you'll find interesting things. And I used to just bop down on my bicycle. It didn't take much longer than clicking on Zoom to get to those places once you know where the bike parking is and where the speakers rooms are. And the questions for both of you is, it sounds like, Ben, you're going in and out of policies. So you haven't really left it, but you have sort of left it. And Yi, what are your future intentions? So one for each. So. Oh, why don't you start there? Yi, go first. What are you going to do next?
Okay. So I think I don't have a long-term career thoughts because I haven't thought that far. I've only very recently got this job. I value the stability a lot after having, moved across the country twice, once for grad school and then for postdoc and then immediately after that. So I like where I am geographically, so I'm going to stay here for a while. OMB, it's an interesting enough place that every year there's some different hot topic. And of course, anytime there's a change in administration, you're working on completely different priorities and completely different policies. So there's always something interesting to learn here. So I think for the short term, I plan to stay here for a few years more. I may transition to a different, agency position at some point, but for someone who's never done, budgeting and any handled money or anything like that before, I've actually found budgeting very fascinating because, you put your money where your mouth is. So the budget is a policy document and it's the one that matters a lot. So I really enjoy the relevance of the budget world. And so I think my short and possibly even midterm, even if I were to go to an agency, I might still be working on the budget, but just on the other side of the table.
Yeah, similar. I don't really know for the long term. The sort of work that I'm doing right now lends itself to kind of a hybrid approach where I can continue to write on some of the policy relevant issues. We're building large scale scientific infrastructure at the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. At the same time, another group at CFA that is just down the hall from us is working to build and improve upon the Greenland telescope in northern Greenland, so the global far north. So there is an increasing great power competition between the United States, Russia, and China in particular the transatlantic Arctic space. So there's a lot of overlay between kind of your standard security policy where you look at, military security infrastructure and economic investment. And, these kind of open questions, how do research stations, how do, the proliferation of kind of positive diplomatic approaches like that, how does that help the situation? How does it interplay with the situation? And so I think there's a lot to look at on that front. And it really just kind of, for me, it's just tremendously fascinating to be able to be a practitioner of that at the same time as I'm kind of in the back of my mind always thinking about, what would be the policy implications of this? How could we do this not just for this project, but more broadly for the federal approach?
Great, thank you. Let's move on to Zoe.
Yeah, hi. Thank you both for such a good talk. This is more of a question for Dr. Schmitt. How did you find coming back into science after kind of being away from it for a while? Was that like an easy transition, or I don't know, could you just elaborate on your experience with that?
Well, it was a quick transition. I had my last day in the office, I think on the Thursday of the previous week, and I was in Cambridge at my office here on Monday. So really, it was very quick. And later in the day, that same day, I was already designing optics components for this for our experiment here. So I don't know. For me, I didn't feel it to be that much of a change coming back. Mostly because all of my life before the 4 years I spent from 2015 to 2019 were in science, and I never really gave that up. I should point out that to the extent possible, I tried to bring in relevant expertise to try to advance our policy wherever possible. I think that I have the State Department history record for being the first person to have an installed version of SolidWorks on their machine at work to kind of look at both the policy side of things, but also look at how do the technical aspects of large scale energy infrastructure, no matter what type it is, how does that interplay with where our policies go on national security decisions, whether it be sanctions policy, whether it be supporting or not supporting certain infrastructure developments by the cooperation between the U.S. and the European Union, and yeah, I personally didn't find it that jarring. I think it was a little more jarring going into policy because it's a brand new endeavor for me. But you know, something that you just kind of roll with.
Jessica, do you have another question? I can never tell if people's hands are still up or if they're, sometimes people have a double question. Okay, so let's go with our last question from Natasha, and then we'll wrap it up after this. Go ahead, Natasha.
Well, I just wanted to let you know I'm the export compliance officer. And I don't know if you've looked at our website on our compliance programs, but we could definitely schedule some time together, because I think you're right, talking to scientists about policy is, you know, you have to say it in the way they can receive it best. But I was wondering if you saw yesterday's paper where Pompeo was going after the lead attorney in The Hague and put her on the sanctions list and froze her assets. And this is the attorney where you go to for human rights and putting drug lords on sanctions list. And Pompeo actually put this attorney on the sanctions list. So I think we do need scientists to vote for administrations that support science and don't support this kind of bullying. And I think it's, sometimes I'm surprised at, like you say, putting the dots together of how that scientists are being supported and by whom. So would love to have lunch with you sometime.
That's directed at me?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I can make two comments on that very briefly so we can get to the wrap-up question. But number one, I think it is tremendously, unfortunate the way, the way that the administration has approached the ICC and in particular the designation of attorneys or basically civil servants in that international organization is really unfortunate, and hopefully can be mitigated in the future somehow. It's I think reputationally damaging for the United States to take such actions with its sanctions program. At the same time, there are a lot of sanctions issues, as you know, being a technical compliance lead that really need science and technology involved. That one might not have been quite as science and technology, tangibly based, but I see your point. I should just point out to everyone on the call that certainly myself, I know that it's got to be the same for Yi. We're nonpartisan civil servants. When you're in the government, when you come through any of these programs, these are not partisan. You're not working for a political party. And I worked under both the Obama and the Trump administration, and have personal opinions about both. But it's something you have to understand. You're serving the country, and you're serving the national interests and national security interests by having your position. And I got a sense, in both administrations that some fellows that would come in through various programs would kind of think that they were in in a political appointee sort of position because they happen to agree with who was in charge at the moment. Well, that's not really the case, in terms of what the scope of your job is. You're a nonpartisan civil servant that is trying to advance U.S. national security and foreign policy interests.
Thanks for putting a flag on that. Couldn't agree more.
Okay, well, we're at time, and so I'm going to wrap up here. I want to thank you both again. Thank you so much for joining us. These are small discussions, but I'm hoping that they're very helpful for the number of people who are here. And I will be dropping this on YouTube so people can watch it if they weren't able to make it, and or rewatch it. I think it might also be useful to rewatch it if you want to Google all of these specific acronyms we've been throwing around during these meetings. So let's thank our speakers with emojis or little claps. Thanks again. I will send an announcement tomorrow, but next week we're really excited to welcome a guest to talk about working at a national lab and being a research scientist. So we're going to try to move through all the different topics. Jasmine, did I neglect to announce anything else? think I,
No, I think you're good.
great. Thanks again for coming, everyone. Have a
Thanks
good
for
Thanks,
rest.
having
everybody.
us.